Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. It's me and I'm flying solo again. Don't ask me why, it is the way it is. I've got a really interesting guest with me today. I'm really excited. We're hitting 20th century history because obviously the best time period of all. I've got Philip Augar with me, who's a historian and journalist who's written several books, including The Bank That Lived a Little, The Death of Gentlemanly Capitalism and The Greed Merchants. And he's here today to talk about his newest book, which was written with writer and documentary maker Keely Winstone, Agent Twister, John Stonehouse, and the scandal that gripped a nation. Welcome, Philip.
Hi, Alina. Thank you very much for having me on board.
Really excited because, first of all, we all love a bit of a scandal, as we always do, and an agent, which makes it even more scandalous. So I'm quite excited to get into this, really.
He's certainly a scandalous agent, I can tell you that. Where shall we start?
Well, let's start with his background. I mean, who was, because we're going to be talking about John Stonehouse. I mean, what was his background all about?
So we're back into the 20th century, as you say, Alina, and we're really in the key decade is the 1960s, and John Stonehouse was a Labour MP at the time. Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. Stonehouse was a rising star in the Wilson government. Some people thought that he was a future prime minister. He was a senior minister, Minister of State for Aviation, Technology. He was Britain's last Postmaster General. And he's a very interesting character. He was devastatingly good looking. Women fell at his feet, which frankly is something that he rather welcomed, as we'll hear a bit later on.
That's a good thing, you know. We do like a dashingly handsome man occasionally.
Yeah, you like a good swoon, I know that. So he's he's got the gift of the gab as well. He's a very powerful orator. He can charm the birds off the trees. At the same time, he's got quite a hard streak, and if he wants to put you down, he can put you down with a very deft choice of words. So charming, persuasive, a hint of steel, a rising star in the Labour government of the 1960s. Not quite not quite on the cabinet, but just the rank below that. Really a very big public figure and much loved by the tabloids and the serious papers. He's often on TV, a lot on the radio. He's a big star in the 60s. The problem for him was, though, that in 1970, Labour lost power. Wilson lost a general election to the Tories, Edward Heath, and Stonehouse becomes no longer a Minister of State, but simply an ordinary backbencher. So that takes us through to the 60s up to 1970. What happens then? He's a backbencher. This doesn't really suit him very much. He's got a taste for high living. He likes the
hold on,
glamorous
don't we
life.
all have a taste for high living?
We do, but there's ways to get it and there's ways not to, aren't there? So he's an MP. He's on a backbencher's salary. He no longer has a minister's pay and perks, but he wants to continue to fund a kind of quite a lavish lifestyle. So what he does, he goes into business. He starts up a business as an export consultant. He develops a wine business, and he even starts a bank. But as we'll perhaps hear a bit later on, it doesn't entirely go according to plan.
Who starts a bank?
Well, someone who sees an opportunity, really. An idea was brought to him by a couple of outside investors. He was the kind of guy who believed that everything he touched would turn to gold, and he went for it. it started to go wrong in sort of the early 70s, and rather sort of face up to it, rather admit that this bank had failed. Together with some of his colleagues, he tried to fool the auditors. And by about 1974, it was really likely that this business was going to go belly up. And so Stonehouse decided to do something about it.
Okay, so going back a little bit into 1971 November, he
Mm.
he just disappears, doesn't he? And well, people presume he's dead. Someone disappears. Tell us about his disappearance and the immediate fallout.
Okay, so it wasn't actually 1971, it was 1974. And by this time, the bank was really going wrong, and his auditors are on to the way that the books have been manipulated, and there's going to be, he's pretty sure, a public disgrace. So things aren't going well there. Things aren't going particularly well either in his marriage. He's always had a taste for let's just say an adventurous lifestyle. His rather saintly wife Barbara has put up with this, but by this time, by 74, he's really desperately in love with someone else. And there is something else that he wants to escape from. There are rumors circulating around that although he was a government minister and a committed member of the Labour Party, throughout this time he had been spying on behalf of the Czechs. The Czechs were part of the Eastern Bloc. They were Russia's kind of easy way in to the West. So things are beginning to build up for him. And so what happens in November 1974 is that he simply disappears and indeed is presumed dead. So
No,
what
I
would
was
you
going
like
to
me to
jump in there. No, I was just going to jump in there and say, I can see why he's disappeared off the face of the earth, first of all. I mean, shit is about to hit the fan. And I'm assuming he's disappeared to kind of cover his ass, cover his tracks at this point.
That's the way it turned out. What he did actually throughout 1974, he began to create a parallel identity. So he knows how the system works really well, and he's an MP. He can get into all sorts of places. So he rings his local hospital and he asks medical records for the names of men about his own age who have died recently, and he concocts a story that he wants to help their widows. So he gets the names of 5 guys about his own age who've died recently. He then visits some of the widows to find out if these guys had ever been abroad. Again, he's using an excuse to help them. He discovers the identity of one person who's about his own age, who's died recently, who's never been abroad, which means that he can apply for her passport in his name. So he carefully gets the birth certificate, applies for a passport, gets the photo taken, forges the signature on the back, does all the thing. But suddenly, by the summer of 1974, he's got an alias. He's got a passport in someone else's name. At the same time, he starts to open bank accounts in this individual's name and begins to create a parallel identity. So what happens in November 74 when he disappears? He takes a flight to Miami. He has a colleague along with him, a colleague who knows nothing about all this to act as witness. And he goes swimming off the coast of Miami, leaves a pile of his clothes at the beach club, and never comes back. And the colleague reports him as missing, presumed dead. What Stonehouse actually does, though, he doesn't go swimming at all. He tiptoes along the beach to a neighbouring hotel where he's left a spare set of clothes, a suitcase, passport, and credit cards in a false name. And then he simply zips across the world to Melbourne, Australia, to start a new life.
Wow. I don't know where to go with this. This is turning into a proper little spy story at this point.
Well, we'll come on to the spying in a minute. I mean, let's just kind of finish the story. So Stonehouse is there. He settled us down in Melbourne. He's a very, very cool guy. He's a very cool customer indeed. He begins to integrate into local society. he joins a jazz club. He goes to barbecues in the apartments where he's staying. He gets business cards printed in his new name as an export consultant, and he's beginning to settle in quite nicely. I should say that by this time, the woman that he's fallen in love with, it was his former secretary, Sheila Buckley. She wasn't in on the act to begin with, but by this time, he has contacted her and said, "Look, I'm not drowned. I'm in Australia." And she starts to write to him, and he goes to just goes out of town from Melbourne to a place called St Kilda, picks up his mail, no doubt hoping to find a letter from Sheila, picks it up, goes to the station to get back on the train to go back into Melbourne, and suddenly someone taps him on the shoulder, and it's Melbourne police who've discovered his true identity, and he's under arrest. And from then on, the whole story unravels. Stonehouse is eventually extradited back to England in the middle of 75, goes on trial. It's a long trial. It's a blazing hot summer that year. The pavements are sweltering. Stonehouse is on trial in the Old Bailey, where the atmosphere also gets pretty hot because he tries to defend himself and annoys the judge. He's charged with credit card theft and deception, and he eventually gets a 7-year jail term. His girlfriend Sheila Buckley is also charged. She gets 2 years, but it's suspended because the judge feels sorry for her. And that, if you like, that's the story of the escape and the story of the capture. It's a guy who has faked his own death to escape looming bankruptcy. I guess he hopes to, in the end, escape with his girlfriend, although I doubt whether she'd ever agreed to that. And you could just say, well, what an interesting story. It's a bit like the Canoe Man, this guy in Britain a few years ago who faked his own death in order to claim off the insurance. But actually, the twist in this one, Alina, is that there is this really intriguing Czech spy scandal, and for you as a contemporary historian, I guess that's what will interest you most.
It will. It will. I mean, I don't know where to go with this. There's so many different directions we can take this podcast in, because Chris has given me a load of questions, and I kind of want to throw these questions out the window because I've got other things that are brewing in my mind. We'll come to the spy thing in a moment. I want to stick to this whole idea of him escaping still and being in Australia. I mean, talk to us what happened when he actually went back to the UK, and he had to basically face Parliament. He had to face all of these people he's basically deceived, he's lied to. What is happening there? Literally, how are these people feeling? What is the reaction of the British? So there's 1,000,001 questions coming out of my mouth at the moment. I'm just like, tell me all of this. I need to know it now.
Okay, well let's try and take the million questions kind of a bit more slowly. So first of all, when he disappears, there's a lot of public interest in it because, as we were talking about at the beginning, he's a kind of charismatic guy, well known in the media, and there's a lot of interest in the disappearance of such a major public figure. The one person who wasn't taken in by this was his boss, Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, a very canny Yorkshireman. And Wilson is in his study at number 10 Downing Street when a diplomat comes in and says that the member for Walsall North, John Stonehouse, has disappeared off the coast of Miami, missing, presumed drowned. Wilson sucks on his pipe, and his first question is, I wonder what his majority was. The diplomat tells him and ushers out, slips out of the room. And Wilson turns to his head of policy and says, I don't believe John Stonehouse has disappeared. I never did trust him.
Smart man.
So, smart man Wilson. So Wilson kind of straight away sees through it. But Stonehouse's wife, Barbara, who's a really amazing woman and comes through as a really strong character in our book. She, his children, his business partners, many of his parliamentary colleagues are absolutely distraught at this shocking news, and they are grieving. Initially they think that they hope that he's missing at sea. Gradually they come to terms with the fact that, as they believe it, that he's drowned. And then suddenly, there are calls start coming in. It's Christmas Eve, 1974. The family are kind of getting ready for their first Christmas without John Stonehouse, and the news comes through that he's been found in Australia. The shock gives way, the grief gives way to joy, and then eventually the joy gives way to different sorts of feelings. The feeling that he must have had some sort of breakdown for this to happen. And over the next few months, the opening months of 1975, the family members go out to Australia. They spend time with him. They believe that he had suffered a really bad mental breakdown. And at one level, there's an element of forgiveness. And certainly his wife, Barbara, all the time portrays herself as the loyal wife. But actually, privately, she's decided that this is just simply a step too far. The serial adultery that's been going on for years. This is the very close relationship he continues to have with Sheila Buckley. She goes out to Australia as well, and Stonehouse tries to divide his time between his wife, who's out there supporting him, and his girlfriend. It kind of blows up, and Barbara Stonehouse, we later learn, decides at some point during this time that once the trial is over, she will divorce him. She's there with him, publicly throughout the trial, but as soon as he's convicted, pretty soon after, a divorce is announced.
Talking about his mistress, we're jumping back and forth from the story, and I'm really sorry to everybody who's listening for this, but my curiosity is, once he gets a divorce, does he end up marrying Sheila?
He does indeed. It looks to Keely and I as though these two were really star-crossed lovers. They were really deeply in love, and they actually seem to have. Once Stonehouse was sentenced 7 years, he serves about half the time. He's out in about 1978, and actually they have a happy and, it would seem, successful decade together. He tries to make a living by writing 4 novels, one of which was under a pseudonym. He's on the chat show circuit. He's got some public speaking events, and it looks like they have a happy 10 years together. And then it's in fact in 1988 on one of the chat shows that Stonehouse dies. It's a typically dramatic ending. He's on the chat show on live TV answering a question. He then looks ill and kind of part stumbles. The lights go out. The program ends, and Stonehouse is taken to hospital and unfortunately died soon afterwards.
Wow, that's a bit of a dramatic ending. I mean, for a dramatic man.
Absolutely, everything about this chap's life is written in big bold capital letters, and whenever there's a dramatic twist, it always occurs.
I'm assuming I'll be sitting on the edge of my seat while reading through his life story and being a proper page turner.
Well, we've tried to write it as though it is actually a kind of espionage novel. And one of the amazing things about this, like you, Alina, I'm a historian. I've never had such rich source material. My co-writer Keely has been working on the Stonehouse case for a number of years in connection with a documentary that she made. The documentary came out last year on Channel 4, and the thing is, everyone sold their story. Barbara Stonehouse sold her story. Sheila Buckley sold her story. Often, both of these often multiple times. The court cases are all documented, so there are loads and loads of witness statements. There was detailed press coverage at the time. There's a wonderful report into the banking fraud written by the Department of Trade, and it's possible from these sources to sort of really recreate every single step of the way. And Keely's really good at finding out the kind of the mood of the times, how people dressed, what the rooms looked like. There are sort of amazing things that emerge, about life in Britain in the sort of late 50s, early 60s, even things like the arrival of pizza, the first night that the general election was covered on TV. There's all sorts of sort of little contemporary details that we put into the book that try and kind of create that contemporary feel and kind of take you back into that age.
So basically, you've written the book properly with proper details, unlike certain things that you come across and you're like, well, that's not possible, and that's not possible. And my point is here is that the amount of times that people say things happened and they actually didn't, and it's nice to be able to hear that it's a well-researched book.
Well, I mean, we like to think so. The sort of base document we has had over 3,000 references in it, which you can't. I mean, that's 10 a page. You can't bury the reader in that. So we've kind of summarized it and tended to put the references at the end of each block of text, so you don't get in the way of them. But I mean, Keely is meticulous. I'm a professionally trained historian. And for both of us, it was important that this book is accurate. The other thing, the other kind of amazing source is that, and we've mentioned the Czech spying thing a couple of times, Alina. There's a
Yeah,
500.
that's going to be my next question actually, as I was going to direct us towards the Czech. Sorry, I did interrupt you.
That's great, because no, not a problem at all. But because while we're on sources, of the 500-page Czech file in the Czech National Archives on John Stonehouse, or Agent Twister, as he was called, and that's the name of our book.
Jesus, I've got to say, I'm happy to be a 20th century historian compared to someone who does ancient history, because the later it is, the bigger, larger wealth of sources that we have available are much easier to work with. Anyway, enough talking about sources. Let's talk about his links to Czechoslovakia, because you were in the National Archives. You've got, what was that, 500-page dossier document? My God, that's a lot of information and a wealth of information. Where does all of this come into, and why Czechoslovakia?
Well, it's why Czechoslovakia is probably the place to start, I would say. And we need to say 1950s, 1960s. We're really in the depth of the first Cold War. Communist Russia is really hardening. It's got imperial ambitions. It's in effect at war, at Cold War with the West. And around Russia, there are a number of satellite states, of which Czechoslovakia is one. And Czechoslovakia is kind of it's sort of midway between the hardline East and the more liberal West. It's under Russian control, but it has still good links with the West. And Russia uses Czechoslovakia as a way into the West. The Czech embassy in London is actually it operates as a legitimate embassy, but it is also a haven for secret agents. In the embassy, what appears to be a great big stationery cupboard, actually, if you open the door of the stationery cupboard and you went in, you would find yourself in the offices of the Czech Secret Service. So Czechoslovakia was very active in trying to get intelligence, which would then be passed back to Russia. And the way they did it, I mean, it's, I'm not an espionage expert, but the way it's done is it's like building a jigsaw puzzle. You get little pieces of information, you put them all together, and in the end, you hope you've got the whole picture. And the kind of person that they targeted would be clearly people of influence, or if possible, people who they thought were actually on the way up, people who would become important figures in public life. And during the 1950s, John Stonehouse was, before he became an MP, he was an aspiring MP. He was involved with the cooperative organisation, and they basically kind of reeled him in. They gave him presents. They initially not just out of so-called friendship. Gradually, as the sums increased, they pressed for more and more information. And as then he becomes elected to Parliament, he's of much more interest to them now. And clearly, once he becomes a minister, he is quite a high value target. But John Stonehouse was no fool, and he realised that the further he got up the political tree, the more risky this thing was for him. I mean, once you take money from an enemy power, and money was given by, I mean, the favourite way to do it was he was told to park his car in a certain place, and they would simply leave money under the car or under the driver's seat or something. But he was quite careful not to get compromised. He was quite careful not to give too much away. He never gave anything away that you could sort of regard as a sort of hardcore military secret. They were perpetually dissatisfied with the information that he gave them. There were useful things he gave, about world events, but he was pretty careful. Unfortunately for him, they photographed him with his handler. They tried to make sound recordings, although the audio isn't particularly good. And he generally preferred to give verbal reports rather than written reports. There's the odd written thing. So it was very much a game of cat and mouse. They tried to compromise him in various ways, but it's this constant kind of battle. We're getting very close to him. He's on the point of giving us a big secret. Then he steps back. It's a really interesting kind of insight into the way that intelligence and counterintelligence works.
I'm assuming he was even smarter to the point that he wouldn't allow them any information that could trace back to him.
That was his hope, although Keely and I are pretty confident that the files do enable you to do that. His big fear was that that one of the Czech agents that he was briefing would defect. And actually, I want to take you back now, if I can, to the year 1969.
Of course.
And this is the penultimate year of Harold Wilson's big government. Wilson was PM from 1964 to 1970. And Stonehouse has been, it's been getting ministerial offices throughout the period. By this time, he's got a position called Postmaster General. And in 1969, he's asked to go to number 10 Downing Street. Ever the optimist, he thinks that this is going to be his big promotion. He thinks the only way you could get called to number 10 to see the Prime Minister, apparently one-on-one, would be that there'll be a big promotion in the offing. So he goes to number 10, knocks on the big black door, makes his way to the cabinet room where he would expect to see Wilson. And he's redirected upstairs, not to the cabinet room, but to one of the number 10 drawing rooms. So he sort of bounces along the corridor, knocks on the door, goes in, and Wilson is there with two people. Wilson says, "Good afternoon, John. You know Michael, I think," and introduces Michael Halls, his private secretary. And Stonehouse nods, but looks over at the other man. And the other man in the room, Wilson says, is Charles Elwell from Counterintelligence. And he says, "John, there are rumors around, and a Czech defector has defected to Washington and has named you as a secret agent. You'll need to talk to Mr. Elwell about this." So Stonehouse's heart must have sunk at that point. This was the very thing that he feared. But he's a very cool customer. Wilson calls the meeting to an end, and then Stonehouse and Elwell have several meetings together. It's all very gentlemanly still. It's 1969. The meetings tend to take place in one of the gentlemen's clubs on Pall Mall. And Elwell can't break Stonehouse down. Stonehouse is a consummate liar. He has an answer for everything. And towards the end of 1969, Wilson gives instructions that MI5 are not to pursue this anymore, that Stonehouse has effectively got off the hook. And to be
Why?
honest, Wilson must have been quite relieved by this, because there were always stories that Wilson was a secret Russian sympathizer. I don't believe it for a moment, incidentally. But that was those stories were always sort of swirling around. Wilson's a secret agent. His administration was in trouble by that time. The economy was out of control. He wasn't. The last thing he needed was evidence that one of his closest ministers was working for the Eastern Bloc. So he would have been quite relieved. It was pretty convenient for Wilson to look the other way. And that, incidentally, prime ministers looking the other way is a pattern that continually repeats itself throughout the next 20 years.
Question. When he faces trial at the Old Bailey, is any of this brought up against him during the trial?
It's not. The reason, Old Bailey is 1975. That's 6 years since the meeting with Wilson and Elwell. Rumors continue to circulate. I mean, after he disappears and when he's suddenly rediscovered, there are stories in the press about the defector from the late 60s, but it doesn't really go anywhere. And it's at his trial, Stonehouse, who conducts his own defense at the trial, and he's really very bad at it. He annoys the judge hugely, and probably doesn't impress the jury either, because he goes on and on and on, and they want to get this case over. But Stonehouse's line of defense is that this case is all cooked up by the press and the media. They even print stories that I was a Czech spy. He says, how ridiculous. So it doesn't come up at the trial, but it comes up pretty soon after the trial in 1978. Now, by this time, Stonehouse is serving the last days of his sentence. He only serves 3.5 years, and Wilson has retired, and he's replaced as prime minister by a man called James Callaghan. James Callaghan is in a precarious position. He's running, in effect, a minority government with needing help from the Liberals. And Callaghan also receives intelligence. Now there's not just one defector, there's another defector as well. These stories are still here. It looks pretty much as though Stonehouse really was a Czech agent. That's the tittle-tattle that is going round. And the Conservative backbenchers, who are now looking for any means they can to tilt Callaghan out of office, they pick up on this. They send someone over to the US. They interview the defector. They tape record the interview with the defector. They bring it back to the UK. They deliver it to Callaghan, and Callaghan sees a transcript of it. So Callaghan now thinks, look, it's 78. This is a bit of a nuisance. I don't really want this to happen at all. My government's in trouble. I've got a wafer-thin majority. The last thing I need is another scandal, but I can't ignore this. Jim Callaghan was a former Home Secretary, a naval man, and he took intelligence matters very seriously. So what does he do? Well, I think he decides that he'll have Harold Wilson in, who by now has been retired for 3 years, and he'll ask Harold Wilson what he remembers about it. And Wilson admits that, or agrees that he had heard the Stonehouse stories. He'd made a statement in the House that there was nothing in them. He says, amazingly, that he can't ever remember meeting Stonehouse to discuss the episode. quite extraordinary given this very dramatic meeting with Elwell, but that's his story, and he's not really able to help. But now now Callaghan gets really clever. He's got the Conservative backbenchers braying for an inquiry. He's very vulnerable himself. He must somehow kind of take this out of the public domain. So what he decides to do is to brief the leader of the opposition on what are called Privy Council terms. You'll know, Alina, as a historian, that Privy Council terms means that this is a conversation that is taking place just between the two of us off the record. Now, the leader of the opposition at that time is still not very well established. It's one Margaret Thatcher. So
hold on. Margaret Thatcher
yeah,
gets involved in all of this.
She does. She is the third prime minister. We've had Wilson, Callaghan, and now Thatcher.
Oh dear. Okay.
So Callaghan is a really a wily old bird. He brings Thatcher in and says, you understand this is on confidential terms. Your backbenchers are demanding an inquiry into the Stonehouse affair. He tells her, I've looked into it. There is evidence against Stonehouse, but not enough to stand up. And then Thatcher finishes the sentence for him in a court of law. Callaghan says that's right. And Thatcher agrees that under the circumstances, she will call off her backbenchers. And she tells them that she's discussed it, or to the effect that she's discussed it with the Prime Minister, and there's not enough evidence to charge Stonehouse. Reluctantly, the backbenchers agree. So now we've got the three prime ministers who are all in it together. The next year, Callaghan loses the general election. Thatcher becomes prime minister. And quite soon after she becomes prime minister, there is another spy scandal. This time it is a man called Anthony Blunt, who's a figure right at the heart of the establishment. He's the keeper of the Queen's pictures. He's a big establishment figure. And it turns out that he has also been effectively spying for the Eastern Bloc. Thatcher is absolutely outraged about this. She makes a statement in Parliament describing such activities as dangerous, treacherous, and contemptible, and she'll have no sort of truck with this kind of thing. We know, don't we, because of the meeting with Callaghan, that that's a bit ironic, but that's what politicians do. So we've give you the timeline again. 1978, we've had the meeting with Callaghan. 1979, Blunt is outed, and Thatcher denounces treachery in the House of Commons. But then 1980, the very next year, more evidence emerges of Stonehouse's activities. And Thatcher is briefed by her Attorney General that there really might be something into this. We might have to have another look at it. There is more inquiries are made, and she decides to have a meeting with her Attorney General, who's a guy called Havers, and a senior Conservative politician, the Home Secretary, William Whitelaw. They sit round and they all discuss it. And the briefing from the Attorney General is that although there is more reason now to be suspicious of Stonehouse, he can't be confident that there would be a successful prosecution, that the evidence wouldn't necessarily hold up in a court of law. And yet again, they agree not to prosecute. So we've now got three separate occasions in the space of 2 years when the Stonehouse affair has popped up again and been dampened down by authorities, quite honestly, who are just, it seems to me, only all too keen to look the other way.
I was going to ask, why is this scandal not as well known as some of the others?
So I think, that's a good question, and it's hard to answer definitively. I suppose there are a couple of reasons. One is that the intelligence Stonehouse gave away was was not of the same grade as the intelligence given away by spies like Burgess, Blake, Philby, Maclean. As we discussed earlier, he was very careful in the material he gave away, and it's fair to say that the Stonehouse family are adamant that that Stonehouse was not a Czech agent, and so there is that issue. But I think mainly it is that this all came out really so long after the event. You know, I mean, the irony you mentioned, you know, the irony about all this is that John Profumo was UK Minister of War in the early 60s, a very important role at the time. He became embroiled in a group of kind of slightly louche London figures, including paid escorts, and also including Russian intelligence officers. And as a result of this liaison, he was required to stand down because of a security risk. He's forced to stand down because of fears of a security risk. Stonehouse actually was a security risk, and he kind of gets away with it. It's one of those quirks of history, really, that we have to understand, live with, and try to explain.
Philip, this has been really great. You know, we get a bit of a scandal, we have a bit of a spy ring going on. There's lots of stuff happening. Can you just remind our listeners the name of your book?
I'd be delighted to do that. The book is called Agent Twister, and it's John Stonehouse, the true story behind the scandal that gripped the nation. My name is Philip Augar, Augar. My co-writer is Keely Winstone, Winstone. The book came out in paperback just a few days ago. If you're able to buy it, we really, really hope that you enjoy reading it. It's one of the most, I mean, I've been writing about history for 40, 50 years. It's one of the most interesting stories I've ever come across, and one I really enjoyed writing, as I've enjoyed talking to you just now, Alina. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. We will get that into our bookshop, and please get it from us, because then Philip gets a nice big chunk of the slice. We get a chunk of the slice, and that company that's named after the river in South America will not get a big slice, as they're apparently building some sort of rocket. Chris always does a better ending to this than I do, so I apologise, everyone, for my rambling. But Philip, thank you so much for joining us. It's been absolutely excellent.
Real pleasure. Loved it. Thanks.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.